Some houses don't keep ghosts. They keep promises no one was brave enough to break. I never believed places could remember people until the day I accepted a temporary archival job at Ashcroft Manor, a sprawling estate hidden beyond a winding road lined with century-old oak trees outside Hartford, Connecticut. The locals had another name for it. The House of Shame. They whispered those words the same way churchgoers whispered confessions, quietly enough to avoid being heard by whatever still lingered behind its stone walls. I laughed the first time I heard the nickname. Every town had its legends. Every old mansion had its ghost story. Mine just happened to come with excellent hourly pay and a confidentiality agreement thick enough to make me wonder what kind of family needed so many signatures before letting someone organize dusty records. I told myself it was only another job. Another paycheck. Another step toward rebuilding the ordinary life I'd spent years trying to protect. My little sedan rolled beneath towering iron gates just after 9 on a gray Monday morning. The tires crunched across a long gravel driveway that seemed to stretch forever before the manor finally emerged through the mist. It wasn't abandoned. It wasn't crumbling. It was immaculate. Every hedge had been trimmed with impossible precision. Every window reflected the cloudy sky like polished glass. Yet the place felt strangely untouched by time, as though the seasons had learned to walk around it instead of through it. I parked near the entrance and stepped out, pulling my coat tighter against the October breeze. The air smelled of cedar, rain, and something older I couldn't quite name. Before I reached the front steps, the massive oak door opened without a sound. An elderly housekeeper greeted me with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Miss Bennet," she said softly. "We've been expecting you." Inside, silence settled over everything like another layer of dust. My footsteps echoed across marble floors while portraits watched from the walls with expressions too lifelike for comfort. Every clock in the house displayed the exact same time. 10:17. None of them moved. I noticed that before I noticed the man standing beside the grand staircase. He wore a charcoal suit without a wrinkle, one hand resting casually in his pocket, the other holding a leather folder. He looked no older than his mid-30s. Dark hair. Pale skin. Calm blue eyes that revealed absolutely nothing. He didn't introduce himself immediately. He simply studied me with the quiet patience of someone accustomed to making decisions after listening rather than speaking. "Claire Bennet," he finally said. His voice was low and controlled. "Welcome to my home." I nodded, suddenly aware of how ordinary I looked with my worn satchel and sensible shoes. "Thank you for having me." "I didn't," he answered. "The trustees did." There was no hostility in the sentence. Somehow that made it colder. He extended the folder toward me. Inside were floor plans, inventory lists, and one handwritten rule on the first page. "Never enter the East Wing." No explanation followed. Just those 5 words written in elegant black ink. I looked up, expecting him to elaborate, but Ethan Carter had already turned away toward the staircase. He paused only once, without facing me. "If you hear music after sunset," he said quietly, "don't follow it." Then he disappeared upstairs, leaving me alone beneath the motionless clocks, wondering why the quietest house I had ever entered already felt like it had been waiting for me all along. The first hour passed without a single sound except the soft turning of brittle pages and the distant tapping of rain against tall windows. I had worked in libraries, museums, and university archives before, but I had never seen records preserved with such obsessive care. Every ledger rested inside custom leather boxes. Every photograph had been catalogued by hand. Every family letter carried the faint scent of cedar, as though someone believed memories could be protected by the smell of old wood alone. The East Wing remained at the edge of my vision no matter where I stood. Its hallway began just beyond the library, separated by polished walnut doors that were closed so perfectly they almost disappeared into the walls. I caught myself looking toward them every few minutes, not because I planned to ignore the rules, but because human curiosity has always been stronger than common sense. Around noon, the housekeeper returned carrying a silver tray with tomato soup, fresh bread, and hot tea. You forgot to eat, she said with a gentle smile. I laughed awkwardly. Is it that obvious? Everyone forgets the first day. Her answer sounded rehearsed, as though many people had stood exactly where I stood asking exactly the same questions. Before I could ask another one, she quietly excused herself and disappeared through another hallway. I ate alone beneath shelves that reached almost 20 feet toward the painted ceiling. Even the silence felt expensive. Every now and then I imagined hearing footsteps somewhere overhead, slow and measured, but whenever I looked up, nothing moved. By early afternoon I had filled nearly 2 inventory sheets when I noticed something strange. Every family photograph after 1998 included only one person. Ethan Carter. As a teenager. As a college graduate. As a businessman. Standing beside governors, charity boards, and community leaders. Never parents. Never siblings. Never anyone who looked like family. It was as if an entire bloodline had quietly vanished from history while leaving the house untouched. I carried the photo album toward the nearest shelf when a familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. Looking for someone? Ethan stood at the library entrance without making a sound. I honestly had no idea how long he had been there. I was organizing the photographs, I answered carefully. I noticed there are not many recent family portraits. His expression did not change. There are enough. I waited, thinking he might continue. He did not. Instead, he walked toward the fireplace, straightened a picture frame that already looked perfectly aligned, and glanced at the rain beyond the windows. People always assume every empty space needs an explanation, he said quietly. Sometimes it is simply empty. I wanted to tell him empty spaces rarely stayed empty forever. They filled with questions. With assumptions. With loneliness. But something about the way he stared outside convinced me he already knew that. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the hills, and for the first time that day the lights flickered. Only once. Barely noticeable. Yet Ethan immediately looked toward the second floor. His calm posture stiffened for a heartbeat before relaxing again. Your room has been prepared if the weather becomes worse, he said. I was planning to drive back into town tonight. Not today. His answer came so naturally it almost sounded like a fact instead of a suggestion. I reached into my pocket and realized my phone had no signal. Not one bar. The internet had disappeared hours ago without me noticing. Outside, the rain had become a solid gray curtain that erased the driveway completely. For the first time since arriving, I realized I could no longer see the front gate. It was as though the world beyond the estate had quietly slipped away, leaving only the house, the silence, and the man who somehow seemed less mysterious than the memories hidden behind those unopened doors. Sleep refused to come that night. The guest room was warm, the bed impossibly comfortable, yet every unfamiliar sound carried through the old walls with quiet determination. Rain continued tapping against the windows while the wind wandered through the surrounding trees like someone whispering secrets just beyond reach. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. The digital clock beside the bed read 11:43. Somewhere deep inside the matter, a grandfather clock chimed midnight, even though every clock I had seen downstairs had been frozen at 10:17. I sat upright. Then I heard it. A piano. Soft. Slow. Delicate enough that I questioned whether I was imagining it. The melody drifted through the hallway like a memory trying to find its way home. Ethan's warning returned immediately. If you hear music after sunset, do not follow it. I repeated the sentence in my mind, almost laughing at myself. I was a grown woman, not a child afraid of ghost stories. Still, I stayed where I was, listening as the melody floated through the silence before disappearing as suddenly as it had begun. Curiosity lingered long after the final note faded. Morning arrived beneath pale sunlight filtering through heavy curtains. The storm had finally moved east, leaving the grounds glistening with fresh rain. After breakfast, I returned to the library determined to focus only on my work. The routine helped. Inventory numbers. Preservation notes. Family correspondence. Every document slowly assembled a picture of extraordinary wealth paired with remarkable generosity. Scholarships. Hospital donations. Restoration projects. Publicly, the Carter family had spent decades improving the community. Yet every newspaper clipping ended with the same strange omission. Personal life unavailable for comment. It was almost noon when I climbed a narrow ladder to reach the highest shelves. A small leather box rested behind several accounting books that had not been touched in years. It contained no jewelry, no cash, no legal papers. Only a tarnished silver key tied to a faded blue ribbon. Attached to it was a tiny handwritten tag. East Conservatory. Before I could examine it more closely, footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. Startled, I slipped the key into my sweater pocket without thinking. Ethan entered carrying another stack of files. His eyes briefly moved across the ladder, the shelves, then settled on me. I wondered if he somehow knew exactly what I had found. "You work faster than anyone before you," he observed. "I like finishing what I start." A faint smile almost appeared before disappearing again. "That can be a gift. It can also become a burden." He placed the files on the table and turned toward the fireplace. "There is an old greenhouse behind the manor. If you need fresh air later, it is the only place on the property that still feels honest." The comment puzzled me. "Only place?" He nodded once. "Plants do not pretend to be anything except what they are." Then he left as quietly as always. My hand instinctively touched the key hidden inside my pocket. East Conservatory. The words matched neither the forbidden east wing nor anything marked on the floor plans. During my lunch break, I unfolded the blueprint Ethan had given me on my first day. Near the edge of the eastern side of the estate, almost erased beneath later renovations, I found a tiny handwritten label. Conservatory. A glass room no longer connected to the main house. Someone had deliberately crossed it out decades earlier. At that exact moment, a folded piece of paper slipped from between the blueprint pages and landed at my feet. It was not part of the plans. Someone had hidden it there long before I arrived. Across the front, written in elegant black ink, were 7 words that made the room suddenly feel much colder. "She never betrayed this family. She protected it." The note stayed folded inside my pocket for the rest of the afternoon, growing heavier every time I remembered it was there. She never betrayed this family. She protected it. 7 simple words. No signature. No date. No explanation. Yet they unsettled me more than every whispered rumor I had heard before arriving at the manor. I finished cataloging another shelf of correspondence, but my attention drifted constantly toward the old blueprint spread across the table. The forgotten conservatory was still there beneath faded pencil marks, almost erased but not completely gone. Someone had wanted it hidden, not destroyed. There was a difference. Late that afternoon I decided to take Ethan's advice and walk to the greenhouse before sunset. The path curved through perfectly maintained gardens where autumn leaves rested like scattered gold across trimmed hedges. Everything outside felt alive in a way the manor never did. Birds crossed the gray sky. A fountain murmured quietly beneath climbing ivy. Even the breeze carried the scent of damp earth instead of polished wood. After nearly 5 minutes, I found the greenhouse. Its iron frame had weathered with age, but sunlight still poured through clean glass panels. Inside, hundreds of plants filled every corner with impossible shades of green. Some had small handwritten labels dating back more than 30 years. Others looked recently watered. I heard footsteps behind me. Most people never come this far. Ethan stood near the entrance, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, holding a small watering can instead of the leather folders he always seemed to carry. Somehow the ordinary task made him appear younger, almost approachable. "You take care of all this yourself?" I asked. He nodded. "Growing something requires patience. Controlling people never does." I smiled before realizing he had not intended the sentence as a joke. He carefully watered a row of white orchids while I wandered farther inside. Near the back wall stood a marble bench facing an old framed photograph protected beneath glass. It showed a smiling woman surrounded by blooming roses. She looked graceful without appearing distant, the kind of person whose kindness reached others before her words did. Beneath the frame rested a simple brass plaque. Eleanor Carter. 1968 to 2001. Beloved mother. Forever missed. I looked back toward Ethan. His eyes remained fixed on the orchids. She built this place, he said quietly. She believed every broken thing deserved another season. There was no bitterness in his voice. Only longing. She seems remarkable. She was. Silence settled comfortably between us until I finally asked the question that had lingered since finding the mysterious note. Why do people call your home something so cruel? The watering can stop moving. Ethan stared at the soil for several long seconds before answering. Because stories survive longer than truth. And the truth? He placed the watering can on a nearby table and looked directly at me. For the first time, the distance in his blue eyes softened enough for me to glimpse genuine exhaustion beneath it. The truth depends on who was allowed to tell it. Before I could respond, an elderly groundskeeper approached carrying a wooden crate of gardening tools. He smiled politely at me, then hesitated after noticing Ethan. Sir, he said carefully, someone unlocked the old conservatory gate this morning. Ethan's expression changed almost too quickly to notice. Calm became alert. That is not possible, he replied. The only key disappeared years ago. My heart skipped once as the silver key hidden inside my pocket suddenly felt colder than metal should ever feel. Ethan thanked the groundskeeper, but his eyes slowly drifted toward the eastern edge of the property where dense trees concealed whatever remained beyond them. Without another word, he began walking in that direction, leaving me standing inside the greenhouse with a secret I had never intended to keep and the growing certainty that finding that forgotten key had never been an accident. The silver key stayed hidden inside my coat pocket through dinner, through another quiet evening, and through every conversation I almost started but never finished. Keeping secrets had never come naturally to me. I had built my career preserving the truth, not hiding it. Yet something inside me insisted that handing the key to Ethan immediately would answer only one question while burying 10 others. The following morning arrived beneath bright October sunlight, the first clear sky since I had entered the estate. From the library windows I watched workers trimming hedges while delivery trucks quietly disappeared through the front gate. Life moved with practiced precision, but beneath that polished routine I sensed tension I could not explain. Shortly after breakfast, the elderly housekeeper approached my desk carrying another stack of family journals. These belong to Mrs. Eleanor, she said gently. Perhaps they will help with your catalog. Her fingers lingered on the leather covers for just a second before she walked away. I carefully opened the oldest journal, expecting recipes or gardening notes. Instead, I found pages filled with observations about people. Birthdays. Charitable projects. Family dinners. Handwritten reminders to send flowers to grieving neighbors. Eleanor Carter seemed to remember everyone else's happiness before her own. Then one entry caught my attention. It had been written exactly 1 month before her final journal ended. Today they blamed her again. Someday someone kind enough will ask why. No names followed. No explanation. Only those 11 words written with remarkable steadiness. My pulse quickened. The mysterious note I had found yesterday suddenly echoed inside my mind. She never betrayed this family. She protected it. Different handwriting. The same message. Someone had spent years trying to defend the reputation of a woman history had quietly condemned. I continued reading until another folded document slipped from between the pages. This one was not personal. It was a newspaper clipping, carefully trimmed and preserved despite its yellowed edges. The headline read, "Local philanthropist withdraws from public life after family scandal." The article itself revealed almost nothing. Rumors. Anonymous sources. Speculation. Every sentence hinted at disgrace without offering proof. By the time I finished reading, I felt more frustrated than informed. Whoever had written the story had built an entire narrative using assumptions instead of facts. Journalists can be remarkably creative when they do not have evidence. Ethan's voice interrupted my thoughts before I heard his footsteps. I looked up to find him standing beside the window, coffee cup in one hand. I held up the clipping. This article never actually says what happened. Because they never knew. Then why did everyone believe it? He looked outside for a long moment before answering. People are uncomfortable with unanswered questions. They would rather accept a convincing lie than live beside uncertainty. I studied his face carefully. There was sadness there, but not anger. It was the expression of someone who had repeated the same truth for years without anyone choosing to hear it. Did your mother ever defend herself? I asked quietly. Ethan slowly shook his head. She believed dignity survived silence. He smiled faintly, though it never reached his eyes. I spent years wondering whether silence was courage or surrender. Before I could respond, a delivery driver entered carrying several archive boxes that required Ethan's signature. As he stepped forward, a folded envelope slipped unnoticed from inside one of the boxes onto the hardwood floor. After everyone left, I picked it up. There was no address. No stamp. Only one sentence written across the front in elegant handwriting that matched Eleanor's journal exactly. If you truly want the truth, begin where the roses no longer bloom. The envelope remained unopened on my desk for nearly an hour because I could not decide which possibility unsettled me more. Either someone inside the manor wanted me to uncover the truth, or someone wanted to see how far my curiosity would carry me before it became dangerous. Neither explanation felt comforting. Eventually I slipped the note into my journal beside the silver key and returned to my work, pretending the morning had not quietly changed everything. By late afternoon I had organized more than 50 years of correspondence, and one detail continued repeating itself with almost impossible consistency. Every spring, Eleanor Carter purchased hundreds of white rose bushes for the estate. Then, without warning, the record stopped. No more orders. No more garden expenses. It was as though the roses had simply disappeared from history. After finishing the last inventory sheet, I wandered outside with the excuse of photographing several stone markers for the archive. The garden stretched across acres of carefully maintained land, yet one section stood in sharp contrast to the rest. Beyond a curved hedge, I found an abandoned circular garden surrounded by weathered brick walls. Empty flower beds rested beneath scattered leaves, their soil untouched for years. The air felt strangely still there, quieter than anywhere else on the property. A rusted metal sign leaned against a cracked fountain. Rose Garden. Closed for restoration. The paint had almost vanished beneath time. I crouched beside one of the empty beds and noticed something buried beneath fallen leaves. It was not another key or another letter. It was a small porcelain plant marker engraved with a single word. Eleanor. Someone had once dedicated this entire garden to her. I brushed away the dirt with my fingertips, wondering why a place built in her honor had been left to disappear. I was hoping you would not find this so soon. The voice startled me, but it was not Ethan. I turned to see the elderly groundskeeper carrying a pair of pruning shears over one shoulder. His face held the patient expression of someone who had spent decades watching seasons change. You knew I would come here? I asked. He smiled gently. People searching for answers always do. He sat carefully on the edge of the fountain before looking across the abandoned garden. Mrs. Eleanor planted every rose with her own hands. Said beauty should always be shared, especially after difficult years. Then why was it abandoned? His smile faded. Because memories can hurt people who are not ready to forgive. Before I could ask another question, a black luxury sedan rolled slowly into the driveway beyond the hedges. The groundskeeper immediately stood. Visitors, he murmured. Unexpected ones. From where I stood, I watched two professionally dressed men step from the vehicle carrying leather briefcases. They were greeted at the front entrance by Ethan himself. Even from a distance, something about the conversation felt different. Formal. Careful. Ethan's posture remained calm, but his shoulders tightened in a way I had never seen before. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. When the sedan finally disappeared beyond the gates, Ethan remained standing on the front steps alone, staring after it long after the vehicle had vanished. That evening, as I returned to the library, I discovered my desk exactly as I had left it except for one impossible detail. The silver key was gone. In its place rested a fresh white rose, still covered with tiny drops of water, and beneath the flower lay a handwritten message in elegant script. Some doors only open after someone chooses to trust you. The white rose remained exactly where I had found it until long after midnight. I turned it over several times, searching for another hidden note or clue, but there was nothing except fresh petals carrying the faint scent of rain. Whoever had taken the silver key had entered the library without disturbing a single document. That realization should have frightened me. Instead, it made me wonder why they had left something so gentle in its place. The next morning the manor felt different. Not louder, not busier, simply more watchful. Staff members greeted one another with the same quiet professionalism, yet conversations ended the moment I entered a room. Even the grandfather clock seemed to echo longer than before. I spent the morning organizing Eleanor's journals, but my thoughts kept drifting toward the missing key and the abandoned conservatory hidden somewhere beyond the eastern trees. Shortly before lunch, the elderly housekeeper appeared beside my desk carrying a handwritten note. "Mr. Carter would like you to join him for tea," she said with an almost relieved smile. In the greenhouse. I followed the familiar garden path beneath a pale autumn sky. The greenhouse shimmered beneath sunlight, every pane of glass reflecting rows of white orchids and climbing vines. Ethan stood near the center table preparing tea with surprising care, measuring loose leaves instead of using tea bags, warming the porcelain cups before pouring the water. The simple ritual seemed completely at odds with the image most people probably imagined when they spoke his name. He motioned toward the empty chair across from him. "Thank you for coming." I accepted the cup, noticing the silence between us felt less uncomfortable than before. "Someone took the key," I said quietly. He nodded once. "I know." That answer surprised me more than anything else. "You know who?" "Yes." "Then why did they leave the rose?" Ethan looked down at the steam rising from his tea before answering. "Because they wanted you to understand that not everyone here is your enemy." The words settled between us with unexpected warmth. For several minutes neither of us spoke. The greenhouse filled the silence with the soft sound of leaves brushing against glass as the afternoon breeze passed outside. Finally Ethan broke the quiet himself. "When I was 10 years old, my mother used to bring me here every Sunday morning. She believed flowers listened better than people." A faint smile touched his face, this time lingering long enough for me to see it clearly. She would spend hours talking while I pretended not to listen. Years later I realized I remembered every word. He gently turned the porcelain cup in his hands. "She told me that one day I would inherit more than property. I would inherit other people's opinions. She warned me that some of them would not belong to me, but they would become my burden anyway." His voice remained calm, yet I could hear something deeper beneath it. Not anger. Grief that had learned how to stay quiet. Did she know what people would eventually say about her? I asked softly. Ethan looked through the greenhouse glass toward the abandoned rose garden in the distance. "She knew long before anyone else did." He paused before adding almost in a whisper, "The hardest lesson she ever taught me was that protecting someone sometimes means accepting that history will misunderstand you." I could not find an answer worthy of that confession. Instead, I simply listened. For the first time since arriving, Ethan was not speaking as the owner of the manor or the guardian of old family secrets. He was simply a son who still missed his mother. As we stood to leave, he reached into the pocket of his coat and quietly placed something on the table between us. It was the silver key. "Keep it," he said. "If you are still searching for the truth after everything you have already seen, Then perhaps you are finally ready to learn why my mother asked everyone to lock that door in the first place. The silver key felt unexpectedly warm in my hand as I walked back toward the manor, as though it had been waiting for someone willing to ask questions instead of accepting legends. Ethan had trusted me with something he could have hidden forever, and somehow that frightened me more than every whispered warning I had heard since arriving. Trust always carried responsibility. By the time evening settled across the estate, the sky had turned the soft blue-gray that comes just before darkness. I unfolded the faded blueprint one more time across the library table. The forgotten conservatory rested beyond the eastern gardens, separated from the main house by decades of renovations. It had once been connected through a narrow stone corridor that no longer appeared on any modern floor plan. The route still existed. It had simply been hidden. I slipped the silver key into my coat pocket and quietly followed the old hallway until polished wood gave way to rough stone beneath my shoes. Dust rested untouched along the walls, and cool air carried the faint scent of moss and cedar. There were no portraits here. No polished furniture. Only silence that felt honest instead of guarded. After several minutes, I reached an iron door almost completely covered by climbing ivy that had found its way indoors through tiny cracks in the stone. The lock matched the shape of the silver key perfectly. My heart hesitated before my hand did. When the key turned, the mechanism answered with a gentle click instead of the harsh sound I expected. The heavy door opened only a few inches before sunlight poured through broken glass panels on the opposite side. The conservatory was still standing. Time had claimed much of it, but not all. Vines climbed across iron beams, wild ferns covered the old tile floor, and shattered windows allowed autumn leaves to drift quietly inside. Yet the room did not feel abandoned. It felt preserved by nature itself. Near the center stood a wooden writing desk protected beneath a canvas cover. Everything else had weathered. The desk had not. I slowly lifted the cloth and found a leather journal resting beside a framed photograph. The photograph showed Eleanor Carter smiling beside a younger man whose face strongly resembled Ethan's. Between them stood a little boy with bright blue eyes, holding a small watering can almost too large for his hands. On the back someone had written, "The last peaceful spring." My chest tightened as I carefully opened the journal. The handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's. The first pages described flowers, charity events, and family dinners exactly like her other journals. Then the entries changed. They became shorter. More cautious. One sentence appeared again and again across several weeks. Truth must wait until kindness is stronger than pride. Near the final pages I discovered a sealed envelope tucked inside a ribbon. Across the front Eleanor had written only one name. Ethan. My hands trembled. I knew I should not open something that had never been meant for me. Before I could decide what to do, I heard quiet footsteps behind me. I turned expecting Ethan, but the elderly housekeeper stood at the doorway instead. There were tears shining gently in her eyes, though she was smiling. She hoped someone with a good heart would find that letter, she whispered. Not to read it. To make sure it finally reached her son. The sealed envelope rested in my hands with surprising weight, as though 20 years of unanswered questions had somehow become paper and ink. The housekeeper never urged me to hurry. She simply stood beside the old writing desk, looking around the forgotten conservatory with the quiet affection of someone visiting an old friend. Mrs. Eleanor came here whenever the world became too loud, she said softly. She believed truth could breathe inside these walls because no one came looking for it. I looked once more at the name written across the front of the envelope. Ethan. The handwriting carried the same calm confidence I had seen throughout every journal. She had expected this letter to survive even if she did not. Did he know this place still existed? I asked. The housekeeper slowly shook her head. He believed the room had been emptied years ago. That was what everyone wanted him to believe. Her answer lingered in the air long after she quietly walked away, leaving me alone with the letter. I carefully placed it inside my satchel without breaking the seal. Some truths belonged to the people who had lived them. Mine was only to protect the path that led back to them. By the time I returned to the manor, evening had settled over the estate. Warm lights glowed through tall windows, making the old house appear almost welcoming for the first time since I had arrived. I found Ethan standing alone in the library, arranging several old photographs into archival sleeves with remarkable patience. He glanced up as I entered, immediately noticing the dust along my coat sleeves. "You found it," he said quietly. It was not a question. I nodded before reaching into my satchel. Without speaking, I placed the unopened envelope gently onto the table between us. For several seconds he simply stared at it. His expression remained composed, but I watched the color slowly leave his face. He touched the paper with careful fingertips, almost afraid it might disappear. "I have searched for this for years," he whispered. "I thought it had been destroyed." "I never opened it," I answered. His eyes met mine, carrying gratitude too deep for words. "Thank you." He lifted the envelope but did not break the seal. Instead, he carried it toward the fireplace and stood looking into the quiet flames. "Would you stay?" he asked after a long silence. I think I should not read her final words alone. I agreed without hesitation. He carefully opened the envelope and unfolded several neatly written pages. As his eyes moved across the first lines, something changed inside him. The guarded distance I had always seen quietly disappeared. He sat down without realizing he had done so. A single tear slipped silently across his cheek before he smiled through it. "She knew," he murmured. "She knew they would blame her." He continued reading until one page slowly drifted from his hands onto the rug. I picked it up and instinctively looked away, unwilling to invade his privacy. My eyes caught only one sentence before I lowered it again. "If my silence protects my son from carrying another family's shame, then I choose silence with love instead of explanation." Ethan closed his eyes for a long moment, pressing the letter gently against his chest. "All these years," he whispered, "I believed she accepted the accusations because she had given up." His voice trembled with quiet realization. She was protecting someone. I looked at the journals, the hidden conservatory, the abandoned rose garden, and every mysterious clue that had slowly led me here. None of them had been pointing toward guilt. They had been pointing toward sacrifice. And for the first time since I crossed the gates of Ashcroft Manor, I realized the greatest secret hidden inside those walls was never who had been blamed. It was the name of the person Eleanor Carter had spent her final days protecting. The manor felt quieter after Ethan finished reading the letter, but it was no longer the heavy silence that had greeted me on my first day. It was the kind of silence that follows a long overdue truth, when words finally stop carrying the entire weight of a memory. Neither of us slept much that night. I remained in the library organizing Eleanor's journals while Ethan disappeared into his study with the letter folded carefully inside its original envelope. Just before sunrise, I wandered onto the front terrace with a cup of coffee warming my hands. The first light spread across the gardens, turning every dew-covered leaf into silver. For the first time, I noticed workers quietly preparing the abandoned rose garden instead of avoiding it. Fallen branches had been gathered into neat piles. Fresh soil rested beside the empty flower beds. No one had announced the change. It had simply begun. Later that morning, Ethan invited me into his study. The room reflected the same order that defined the rest of the manor, except for one wall covered entirely with framed photographs of Eleanor. Some showed elegant charity events. Others captured ordinary afternoons beneath blooming trees. One picture showed a little boy laughing as his mother wiped dirt from his cheek after planting roses together. Ethan stood beside the photographs for several moments before speaking. "I spent 20 years protecting this house because I believed it was the last thing she wanted saved." He slowly looked around the room. "Now I realize she never cared about the house. She cared about the people inside it." He placed the letter beside a stack of legal documents waiting on his desk. "There is one name she never mentioned directly. Only initials. R.H. I frowned, trying to remember every newspaper clipping and journal entry I had catalogued. Then it came to me. Richard Holloway. Ethan looked up immediately. You know the name? I nodded. He served on your family's charitable foundation for almost 15 years. His signature appears on dozens of financial records. Ethan walked toward the archive cabinet without another word. Together we searched through foundation reports until we found what we needed. Richard Holloway had quietly resigned only weeks after Eleanor withdrew from public life. No explanation. No farewell statement. Just a signature disappearing from every official document afterward. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the page. He was my father's closest advisor. And after he left? He built one of the largest private investment firms in New England. Something about the timeline felt wrong. Too convenient. Too carefully arranged. Before either of us could continue, the housekeeper gently knocked on the open door. Mr. Carter, she said softly, Mr. Holloway has arrived. Ethan and I exchanged the same surprised look. Neither of us had expected the name to walk through the front gate only moments after uncovering it. Through the study window I watched a distinguished man in his early 70s step from a dark sedan wearing an immaculate navy overcoat and carrying a polished cane. His movements were slow but confident, like someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went. He smiled warmly as the front door opened, yet the smile never reached his eyes. Ethan quietly folded Eleanor's letter and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. For years, he said almost to himself, I believed I had inherited my family's greatest burden. He looked toward the front entrance where Richard Holloway now waited inside the grand foyer. Perhaps today I finally meet the man who handed it to us. Richard Holloway accepted Ethan's invitation into the study with the confidence of someone returning to a place he believed still belonged to him. He admired the familiar bookshelves, the antique desk, even the landscape beyond the windows before finally settling into one of the leather chairs. It has been far too long, he said warmly. Your mother would have been proud to see how well you preserved everything. Ethan remained standing instead of taking the chair across from him. Perhaps she would have preferred that I preserved the truth instead. The room fell silent. Richard's pleasant smile barely shifted, but I noticed the subtle pause before he answered. Truth is a complicated thing. Ethan reached into his jacket and placed Eleanor's letter gently on the desk. Not always. Richard's eyes settled on the envelope for only a moment before he calmly looked away. It was enough. He recognized it immediately. I watched decades of carefully rehearsed composure flicker behind his expression. I wondered whether that letter still existed, he admitted quietly. She hid it well. Ethan did not ask how he knew the letter had been hidden. He simply waited. Sometimes silence reveals more than questions ever can. Richard slowly removed his glasses and folded them with deliberate care. Your mother was the finest person I have ever known, he said. She believed protecting others mattered more than protecting herself. Ethan's voice remained steady. Who was she protecting? Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment before answering. My daughter. Neither of us spoke. The confession landed with astonishing gentleness after years of suspicion. Richard continued before anyone interrupted him. She was a young accountant working for the family foundation. She made a terrible financial mistake that would have destroyed her career before it truly began. Eleanor discovered it first. He looked toward the photographs lining the wall. She quietly corrected the records herself, accepted public responsibility for irregularities no one else understood, and refused to explain because she knew my daughter would lose everything if the truth became public. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. My mother carried another family's burden for 20 years. Richard nodded slowly. She believed a life could be rebuilt if someone was willing to offer grace instead of judgment. Tears gathered in his eyes, though his voice never failed him. I begged her to let me confess. She refused every time. She said shame spreads when people try to divide it, but kindness ends it. The room became impossibly still. Every mysterious note. Every abandoned garden. Every hidden journal suddenly fit together with painful clarity. Eleanor had never been protecting wealth, reputation, or power. She had been protecting hope for a frightened young woman who made one mistake. Ethan walked slowly toward the fireplace, looking at the framed photographs of his mother with entirely new understanding. "All these years," he whispered, "I built walls because I thought they honored her sacrifice." He turned back toward Richard. "She never wanted walls." Richard lowered his head. "No. She wanted forgiveness." Ethan remained quiet for a long moment before picking up the legal documents that had rested untouched on his desk since morning. Without hesitation, he signed the final page and slid the papers toward me. "The Carter Foundation will be reorganized," he said calmly. "Every scholarship my mother began will continue. The abandoned gardens will be restored. And every historical record connected to her name will finally include the complete truth." He smiled faintly, not with triumph but with peace. "Some inherit houses. My mother left me something far greater. She taught me that protecting people will always matter more than protecting pride." The transformation began quietly, almost the way spring arrives before anyone notices the first green leaf. No grand ceremony announced the changes at Ashcroft Manor. There were no newspaper headlines declaring redemption. Instead, workers carefully restored the abandoned rose garden one flower bed at a time. Broken stone borders were repaired. Fresh soil replaced years of neglect. New white rose bushes arrived every morning, each one planted according to Eleanor's original handwritten sketches that I had preserved inside the archive. Ethan insisted on planting the very first rose himself. He wore the same simple work gloves I had seen inside the greenhouse, kneeling in the earth without the slightest concern for expensive shoes or tailored clothes. "She always said roots matter more than appearances," he told me with a quiet smile. Perhaps she was right about more than flowers. I knelt beside him, gently covering the roots with fresh soil. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. Over the following weeks the manor slowly changed in ways visitors immediately noticed but could never fully explain. The motionless clocks were repaired and began keeping time again. Curtains that had remained closed for years were opened to welcome sunlight into forgotten rooms. The conservatory was carefully restored instead of hidden, its broken glass replaced while the climbing vines remained exactly where nature had chosen to leave them. Ethan refused to erase the years that had passed. "Healing does not mean pretending something never broke," he said one afternoon while reviewing restoration plans. "It means honoring the cracks without allowing them to define the future." Richard Holloway returned several times, not as a powerful advisor but simply as an elderly man carrying flowers for Eleanor's memorial garden. He never tried to defend the choices that had led everyone there. Instead, he quietly funded new educational scholarships under Eleanor's name, asking for no recognition whatsoever. His daughter, now a respected accountant nearing retirement herself, wrote Ethan a handwritten letter expressing gratitude she had never believed she would have the courage to share. Ethan read it privately before placing it beside his mother's journals inside the newly restored archive. "Some stories deserve to remain together," he said softly. "My own assignment should have ended weeks earlier." Every document had been catalogued. Every photograph preserved. Every forgotten journal carefully indexed. Yet each time I prepared to leave, another reason quietly appeared to stay one more day. Sometimes it was a new restoration project. Sometimes it was another conversation in the greenhouse. More often, it was simply watching Ethan slowly become the man his mother had always believed he could be. One cool October evening we stood together beside the restored rose garden as the final rays of sunlight settled across hundreds of blooming white roses. Families from the nearby town wandered through the paths, children laughing while volunteers prepared for the foundation's first public charity event in more than 20 years. No gates were closed. No signs warned visitors away. Ethan looked across the garden before turning toward me. "Do you know what surprises me most?" he asked. I shook my head. For years I believed this place needed someone strong enough to protect it. His eyes settled gently on the roses surrounding us. It only needed someone kind enough to tell the truth. A cool breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms through the evening air, and for the first time since I had accepted a temporary archival job behind those old iron gates, I realized the manor no longer felt like a monument to silence. It had become exactly what Eleanor Carter had quietly hoped it would one day become. A home where forgiveness finally had room to bloom. Winter arrived gently that year, covering the gardens with a thin layer of frost that sparkled beneath the morning sun instead of hiding the life waiting beneath it. My temporary assignment had officially ended 3 weeks earlier, yet I still found myself unlocking the archive every morning with the same familiar key Ethan had insisted I keep. Some doors should never close again, he had told me when I tried returning it. I understood what he meant now. The manor no longer belonged only to its past. It had begun welcoming its future. School groups visited the restored conservatory to learn about local history. Volunteers gathered every Saturday to care for Eleanor's rose garden. Families who had once crossed the street rather than looked toward the old estate now wandered its pathways carrying coffee, laughter, and curious children who asked questions without fear. The name people had whispered for decades slowly disappeared from ordinary conversation, replaced by something much simpler. The Carter Gardens. One quiet afternoon I finished placing the final restored journal onto its shelf and stepped back to admire the archive that had become something far greater than a collection of documents. Every photograph had found its rightful place. Every letter had been preserved. Every chapter that history had tried to erase now stood beside the truth without shame. As I closed the cabinet doors, I noticed Ethan waiting near the library window with 2 steaming mugs of tea. "I thought you might need a break," he said. I accepted the cup with a grateful smile. "I thought my job ended weeks ago." "Perhaps the paperwork did." His eyes drifted toward the snow-covered gardens outside. "Some work takes longer than contracts." We walked through the manor together without speaking very much. Words had become less necessary between us. We passed the grandfather clocks that now kept perfect time, the bright hallways filled with winter sunlight, and the restored conservatory where children had left colorful drawings of flowers hanging beside the windows. Everything that had once felt distant now carried quiet signs of ordinary life. When we reached the rose garden, Ethan stopped beside the marble bench where Eleanor's photograph overlooked the pathways she had imagined decades earlier. Fresh white roses rested beneath the frame despite the cold, protected by simple glass covers that volunteers carefully maintained each week. Ethan smiled softly. "She would have liked this." "She built it long before either of us understood it," I answered. He nodded before looking at me with the same calm blue eyes that no longer carried the loneliness I had first seen on the grand staircase months before. "You know," he said, "everyone believes you came here to organize old records." I laughed quietly. "Did I not?" "No." His smile grew warmer. "You reminded me that memories belong in libraries. People belong in the present." The winter breeze carried the faint scent of cedar and roses across the garden, and for a long moment we simply watched families strolling through the pathways Eleanor had once planted with hope instead of certainty. I realized then that the greatest miracle I had witnessed inside those old walls was never the discovery of hidden letters or forgotten rooms. It was watching one act of quiet compassion survive long enough to change lives it was never meant to touch. As the afternoon sunlight settled across the white roses, I finally understood something Eleanor Carter had been trying to teach through every journal, every flower, and every sacrifice she quietly left behind. Shame can build a house. Fear can lock its doors. But only love has the patience to open every window and invite the light back inside.